Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The Rome of the late imperial age was not the city of clean white marble that so many imagine today. The streets were narrow and clogged with the scent of human life, oil lamps burning in the evening, bakers pulling bread from blackened clay, ovens, tanners boiling hides, and a constant undercurrent of sewage being washed downhill toward the Tiber. Above all this, high on the Palatine Hill, the imperial palace stood like a world unto itself, removed from the street chatter and market cries. Inside those walls, a man who was both feared and revered sat at his table long after the torches were lit. He was not reading the latest petitions from the Senate or viewing military orders. Instead, he bent over a wax-covered tablet, scratching lines that would puzzle even his most trusted aides. The emperor. His name, whispered with both loyalty and resentment across the empire, had developed a habit that was unlike any of his predecessors. Every night, when the last of the servants had withdrawn and the corridors grew quiet, he would take up a stylus and write. Not official decrees, not speeches for the forum, but something else entirely. Pages and pages of tightly woven script, in a language no one could quite recognize. It looked like Latin at a glance, but the sentences twisted in unexpected ways, and odd symbols broke up the flow of words. He kept these writings locked away in a cedar chest, and the key was always within reach, tucked into a leather cord that he wore under his tunic. Even his personal secretary, K, a man who handled imperial correspondence with the precision of a craftsman, was never permitted to look inside. In Rome, such secrecy was dangerous. Words had power, perhaps more than armies. A single accusation, preserved on parchment, could destroy a senator's career. A careless phrase about the loyalty of a general could spark mutiny in the provinces. And so, the idea that the emperor himself was keeping a hidden record in a form no one could read was unsettling to those who heard whispers of it. The code, historians believe, may not have been intended merely for privacy. Some ancient accounts hint that it was a form of personal meditation, a way for the emperor to think freely without the fear that his words would be twisted by the Senate or immortalized in marble inscriptions. Others think he was recording truths that could not be spoken in public, truths about the state of the empire, the corruption of his inner circle, or the private dealings with foreign kings that would scandalize Rome if revealed. But what made the practice remarkable was not just the secrecy, it was the discipline. Every night, without fail, he added to this private work. On nights when state banquets stretched past midnight, he would excuse himself early, claiming a headache only, to return to his chamber and write until the oil in the lamp ran low. On nights when storms rattled the palace windows and the torches in the corridors guttered in the wind, he still sat there, head bent, filling line after line with symbols only he could decipher. A handful of servants began to suspect what was happening, though they could not have guessed the content. One eunuch who cleaned the room each morning noticed that the wax tablets were sometimes warm to the touch, as though they had been pressed hard under the stylus for hours. Another claimed that once, while bringing in a fresh jug of wine, he saw a single tear roll down the emperor's cheek as he stared at the words he had just written. The very existence of this coded diary became something like a palace myth, an invisible thread running through the daily business of the empire. No one dared to speak of it openly, yet it lingered in the thoughts of anyone who had ever served in the private quarters. Why keep such a record? Why hide it from even the closest advisors? And, perhaps most dangerous of all, what might happen if those words ever fell into the wrong hands. Beyond the palace walls, Rome was restless. The frontiers strained under pressure from migrating tribes. The treasury leaked silver into the hands of mercenaries, and the Senate, reduced in power, but still clinging to influence, watched the emperor's every move for signs of weakness. It was a time when rumors could be sharper than daggers. In such a climate, a secret record was not merely a personal indulgence. It was a liability. And yet the emperor persisted. There are no surviving eyewitness accounts of the diary itself. What we know comes from fragments in later histories, passing mentions in works that were themselves copied and recopied over centuries. One writer, Cassius Felix, claimed that the emperor referred to the diary as memoria clausa, the closed memory. Another, less reliable source described the entries as letters to the future, though whether that meant they were intended for his descendants, for Rome itself, or for some higher power, we cannot say. The act of writing in code was not unheard of in Rome. Merchants used shorthand to keep trade secrets. Lovers devised private alphabets for their correspondence. But for the emperor to do it, and with such diligence, suggested something deeper. It may have been inspired by the practices of certain Greek philosophers who believed that some truths were too disruptive for the masses and should be hidden until society was ready. Or perhaps it was simply a man's attempt to protect his own unguarded thoughts in a world where even a whisper could turn deadly. Whatever the motive, the coded diary was growing. It was no longer a single stack of wax tablets, but several stacked neatly in the cedar chest. From time to time, the emperor would order new tablets brought in from the best craftsmen, ensuring that the surface was smooth, the wax pure, and the wood frame resistant to warping. He was building something, piece by piece, even if no one else could yet see its shape. And then, without explanation, the emperor changed his habit. Instead of locking the diary away each night, he began to seal certain pages with thin sheets of beaten gold, pressed so tightly over the wax that the writing beneath could not be read without breaking the metal. The gold was engraved with meaningless, decorative patterns, almost like a burial shroud for the words underneath. The purpose of this change remains one of the great mysteries. Was it to prevent tampering? To signify that certain entries were of special importance? Or was it, as some later speculated, a symbolic gesture, a way of weighing down his most dangerous thoughts with the heaviest metal Rome knew? From this point on, the diary ceased to be a rumor known only to a handful of servants, and the presence of gold, always a subject of curiosity and greed, made it impossible to keep entirely secret. Whispers began to circulate among the guards, then among the palace scribes, and finally among the wider court. Some said the gold-sealed pages were love letters to a forbidden mistress. Others claimed they were confessions of crimes the emperor had committed to gain power. Still others, more superstitious, insisted that they contained prophecies, visions of Rome's future that were too terrifying to reveal. The truth, of course, remained locked away in that cedar chest, but the story of the diary and of the gold that now guarded parts of it was beginning to take on a life of its own, and in a city where ambition and suspicion walked hand in hand. It was only a matter of time before someone decided that the contents needed to be uncovered, no matter the risk. What none of them yet realized was that the gold was not the final form of the diary's protection. In time, the emperor would take an even more extreme step, one that would seal his words away for centuries, perhaps forever. And it was that decision, more than the writing itself, that would spark the question. Historians still ask, why go to such lengths to hide thoughts that no one else could even read? In the marble corridors of the Palatine, secrets traveled not in shouts, but in careful half-sentences. They moved like smoke, curling into the ears of those who knew how to listen, vanishing when questioned directly. By the second year of the emperor's strange new habit, the whispers about the gold-sealed pages had spread far enough to reach men and women who had never set foot inside the private quarters. The court was a place where almost nothing remained private. A dropped phrase overheard by a slave in the baths could reappear hours later as a rumor at a senator's banquet. A frown noticed by a guard during a public ceremony could become, by evening, a full account of an imperial quarrel. And so, when talk began to circulate that the emperor was locking away pages wrapped in pure gold, curiosity sharpened into something more dangerous suspicion. Some thought of it in purely political terms. The emperor had enemies, both open and hidden. Many of them wanted proof of weakness, hypocrisy, or treachery. The diary contained any admission that could be twisted into such proof. It might serve as a weapon sharper than any gladius. Others, however, considered it from a different angle. Wealth, gold, was wealth made visible, weighty and alluring. If even a fraction of what the rumor suggested was true, then the emperor was hoarding precious metal in an unsecured form. The problem was that the emperor was not a careless man. His routines were almost painfully predictable. Each morning, before the formal meetings began, he walked alone in the small peristyle garden outside his study. He examined the same plants, adjusted the placement of the same small marble statues, and occasionally nodded to the guards who stood at attention beyond the colonnade. He had the air of someone who trusted no one but himself to observe the details of his environment. Even the location of the cedar chest was known only to him. The servants who cleaned his chamber never saw it in the same place twice. One day it might be hidden behind a draped screen near the brazier. The next it might vanish entirely, only to reappear the following evening beneath a table in the adjoining library. It was clear that the emperor had given thought not only to the contents of the diary, but to its physical safety. This made the task of uncovering the truth, or even confirming the diary's existence, nearly impossible. But in Rome, impossible was often only another word for worth attempting. Among the emperor's inner circle was a man named Marcellus Livius, a senior member of the imperial guard. He had served in the legions before being elevated to his post in the palace, and his loyalty to the emperor was considered beyond question. But loyalty in Rome was a fragile thing, easily bent by ambition or fear. Marcellus had heard the rumors like everyone else. At first, he dismissed them as the idle talk of servants with too much time on their hands. But one evening, while accompanying the emperor on a short journey to the summer villa outside the city, Marcellus noticed something that gave him pause. The emperor traveled light, a small retinue, few chests of clothing, the usual gifts for local dignitaries. Yet, among the baggage was one cedar chest, smaller than the rest, which the emperor insisted on keeping within arm's reach at all times. It was carried into the villa by the emperor himself, not by servants. And on the return journey, the chest seemed noticeably heavier. That was the moment when Marcellus began to believe the rumors. Still, belief was one thing, and action was another. To attempt to open the emperor's private possessions was to risk execution. Not even the most senior guard could plead ignorance in such a matter. So Marcellus waited, watching, listening for any hint that the emperor's behavior might offer an opportunity. It came sooner than he expected. One spring night, during the festival of Floralia, the city erupted in celebration. The streets filled with dancers, actors, and games. Even the palace staff were given partial leave to attend the public entertainments. The emperor himself participated in a brief ceremonial appearance before withdrawing to his private quarters. That night, however, he did not follow his usual writing ritual. Instead, he summoned a trusted physician to treat a sudden illness, nothing serious, but enough to delay his return to the cedar chest. While the emperor was occupied, Marcellus stationed himself near the study, under the pretense of guarding the entrance. He saw the door to the chamber left ajar by a careless attendant. Inside, In the faint lamplight, he could make out the corner of the cedar chest, partly hidden beneath the tapestry. He took a single step toward it and froze, the gold seal on. The visible page glinted in the low light. It was not a sheet, as the rumors had described, but something more intricate, a layer of molten gold poured directly over the wax and allowed to harden, locking the words beneath in a solid, unbroken surface. This was not something that could be peeled away like parchment. To remove it would require melting it again, and that meant fire, heat, time, and noise. Marcellus withdrew. His curiosity deepened rather than satisfied. The use of molten gold was not merely a matter of extravagance. In Rome, such an act carried symbolic weight. Gold was incorruptible, immune to rust, untarnished by time. To seal one's words in gold was to declare them untouchable, perhaps eternal. And yet, paradoxically, it was also a way of ensuring that they could not be read without destroying the very form in which they were preserved. This was the point at which speculation about the diary took a darker turn. If the emperor had gone to such lengths, it was no longer enough to suggest that the contents were personal musings or even political secrets. Some began to suspect that they might be confessions of acts so extreme that even the empire's brutal politics could not forgive them. Others wondered if they were records of treaties made in bad faith, alliances with enemies, or most tantalizing of all, predictions of Rome's decline. By the summer, the diary had become more than a curiosity. It was a shadow hanging over the palace. No one spoke of it openly, but it shaped the way people looked at the emperor. His silence on the matter only made it worse. If he had explained, even in vague terms, what the gold-sealed pages contained, the tension might have eased, but he said nothing, and in Rome, nothing was often more dangerous than words. In the absence of truth, the human mind fills gaps with invention. And the inventions surrounding the diary were beginning to take on a life of their own. By the time autumn came, Marcellus was no longer the only one actively seeking answers. A senator with fading influence, a palace scribe with debts to pay, and a freedwoman with connections to the imperial kitchens all began their own quiet attempts to discover what was in that chest. None would succeed, but their efforts would trigger a chain of events that would, within a year, make the diary vanish entirely, along with the emperor himself. And that disappearance would leave behind a question that endures, even now. Was the gold meant to preserve the words for the future, or to ensure they were never read at all? The year the diary disappeared was not marked by disaster at first glance. Rome's harvests were steady, the provinces were relatively calm, and the emperor's public image, though tinged with quiet suspicion, remained intact. But beneath the orderly surface of the empire's routines, the air was brittle, whispers like the hairline cracks in an ancient marble column, spread slowly but could not be repaired without tearing down the structure entirely. The cedar chest, as far as anyone could tell, remained in the emperor's possession. It traveled with him to summer villas, military inspections, and religious festivals, always kept within sight, always guarded by the emperor's own hands more than any servants. But those who paid close attention noticed subtle changes. The chest was not opened as frequently as before. Days would pass without the emperor adding a new page. When he did write, it was brief, hurried, and often followed by a restless pacing of the garden that lasted well into the night. Some believed this change was due to external pressure. The emperor may have been warned, perhaps by a trusted advisor, that his secret was becoming too widely discussed. Others thought the diary had simply run its course, that whatever purpose it served for the emperor had now been fulfilled, and that he was deciding what to do with it before he died. In Rome, rulers could not trust that their heirs would honor their private wishes. The dead had no power to protect secrets once their bodies were cold. by late winter. The tension had hardened into a near certainty among those closest to him. Something was going to happen to the diary. The only question was what dot it happened. As so many endings do, without warning, the emperor was in the imperial baths that afternoon, conducting an informal audience with the visiting general. The session lasted longer than usual, giving the palace staff time to make small adjustments to his quarters in preparation for the evening meal. When he returned, the cedar chest was gone. At first, it was assumed that the chest had simply been moved again, as was his habit, but a thorough search of the quarters, the adjoining rooms, and even the restricted vault where state documents were kept yielded nothing. No one had seen it carried out. The guards at the main gates swore under oath that no such object had passed them that day. The emperor's reaction was strange. He did not order an immediate execution of the suspects. He did not summon the guard captains to explain themselves. Instead, he retreated to his private garden for hours, speaking to no one. That night, the only sound from his chambers was the soft scratch of a stylus dot. By morning, the palace awoke to find that the emperor had left Rome entirely. He departed with a small retinue, traveling under the pretext of inspecting the coastal fortifications. The journey lasted 3 weeks, during which no one in the city saw or heard from him directly. When he returned, the cedar chest was not with him, nor was there any sign that he intended to recover it. This silence from the emperor only deepened the mystery. It was as if he had decided to erase the diary from existence, along with the curiosity it had stirred. But, of course, such an erasure was impossible. In Rome, an object so tantalizing could only grow in legend once it was gone. The competing theories within months. The empire's gossip machine had constructed at least 4 competing explanations for what had happened. The political scandal theory. According to this account, the diary contained a written record of backroom agreements that, if revealed, would have destroyed the emperor's legitimacy. Names of senators who had betrayed their peers, foreign rulers bribed into compliance, and perhaps even conspiracies against previous emperors were supposedly listed in detail. Those who supported this theory argued that the diary was seized by the emperor's own allies and destroyed to protect him. The religious heresy theory. Others claimed the diary was not about politics at all, but about the gods. In an age when divine favor was the foundation of imperial authority, even a hint of blasphemy could undermine a ruler. The rumor here was that the emperor had recorded private doubts about the gods, perhaps even mocking their rituals, or that he had secretly adopted the beliefs of a foreign cult considered dangerous by the Senate. Such writings, sealed in gold, could have been intended for a future audience, or hidden from one forever. The prophecy theory. This theory was the most tantalizing to later generations. Suggested that the diary contained the emperor's own predictions for the fate of Rome, perhaps based on omens, dreams, or secret reports from distant provinces. The melted gold in this telling was meant to preserve those predictions until a future date when they would be revealed. This was true. Then someone, perhaps fearing the prophecy or wishing to prevent panic, had ensured that it would never see the light of day. The personal confession theory. A smaller but persistent group of storytellers believed the diary had nothing to do with politics or religion at all. Instead, it was a deeply personal record, a confession of crimes or desires the emperor could not admit publicly. Murders carried out in secret, forbidden love affairs, betrayals of family, all could be imagined within the pages. The gold seal, in this case, was not to impress or to safeguard, but to give a final dignity to the most private truths. The gold as the only survivor, no matter which theory one believed. All agreed on one fact: the melted gold seals were never found. If the chest had been stolen, the gold could easily have been melted down for coinage or jewelry. But no sudden influx of unusual gold appeared in the markets. If it had been destroyed by order of the emperor, then perhaps the gold was recast into objects for the palace, objects that still exist, their origins unknown. Some even claimed that a pair of small golden figurines in a provincial temple had been made from that very metal. Centuries later, during excavations near what was once the imperial summer villa, archaeologists uncovered a handful of warped gold fragments embedded in a collapsed wall. The gold bore traces of heat damage consistent with melting, but there were no markings, no inscriptions, nothing to tie them conclusively to the diary. Still, to those who wanted to believe, they were all the proof needed. The emperor's final days, the disappearance of the diary, did not immediately end the emperor's reign, but it changed him. Observers noted that he became less engaged in public life, more withdrawn. He still appeared at ceremonies, still signed decrees, but his voice no longer carried the same conviction. Some thought he mourned the loss of the diary itself, as if it had been more than a record, perhaps a companion, a mirror of his own thoughts that no human confidant could replace. Others suspected he had arranged for its disappearance, and now lived with the weight of that decision. In his final year, the emperor ordered the construction of a small mausoleum on a quiet hill outside the city. He died before it was completed, and his ashes were placed in a plain marble urn inside the unfinished structure. No will was ever found, no instructions for the diary, no hint of where it might have gone. In the centuries that followed, the mausoleum itself fell into ruin, its stones scavenged for other buildings. If the diary had ever been hidden there, it too was lost. The legacy of an unread book. Strange thing about the diary's legend is that it endured not because of what it contained, which no one could confirm, but because of the physical act of sealing it in gold. That single detail, repeated over generations, became a symbol of secrecy and authority. Writers in later centuries would refer to words sealed in gold as a way of describing truths too dangerous to be spoken. Historians, of course, debated the plausibility of the entire story. Some argued that it was a complete fabrication, born of political gossip and embroidered over time. Others pointed to scattered references in surviving records that hinted at an imperial writing habit, or to procurement logs showing unusual quantities of gold purchased by the palace during the emperor's reign. The truth, if it exists at all, remains buried, perhaps in the soil of a forgotten estate, perhaps melted and reshaped into something that sits unnoticed in a museum display. And so the question remains, as it did in the year the cedar chest vanished, was the gold meant to preserve the words for the future, or to ensure that no living soul would ever read them? The year was 212 AD, a time when Rome's bureaucracy had reached a level of precision that was both inspiring and suffocating. Every imperial edict, every census tally, every military victory or defeat was carefully recorded and filed. This vast collection of official records was not kept in some grand marble hall, but in a windowless, unremarkable building near the Forum, guarded day and night by men whose loyalty was tested as often as their ability to stay awake during the long shifts. Inside, among the clerks and scribes, worked a man named Marcus Valerius Quintalis. This was not a position of public glamour. Few citizens even knew his name. Yet his hands had touched more of the empire's most sensitive documents than any senator or general. For Marcus, the archives were not merely a workplace. They were the empire's memory, and to guard them was to guard Rome itself. That summer, a courier arrived from the imperial palace carrying a small chest. The chest was cedar, bound with bronze bands, and sealed with the emperor's personal signet. The wax was still warm, a sign the order had been urgent. The accompanying letter was brief, written in a hand Marcus recognized from previous directives for immediate placement in the restricted vault. No copies are to be made. No summaries to be entered into the general index. The seal is not to be broken without direct imperial instruction, by order of the emperor. Marcus had received sealed orders before, but never with such explicit restrictions. Even documents of war councils or reports from the provinces usually required at least a basic entry in the archives index. This chest, however, was to remain invisible, a ghost in the collection, existing without existing. The weight of a chest, no bigger than a helmet. Marcus set the chest on a table in his private office. It was heavier than it appeared. The bronze bindings were not merely decorative. They were thick and expertly riveted, suggesting that whatever was inside was meant to survive centuries. The seal bore a faint impression that made Marcus pause. It was not the standard imperial eagle or laurel wreath. Instead, it depicted a small flame surrounded by concentric circles, a symbol he had only ever seen once before. Many years ago, on a set of confiscated scrolls that were burned by order of the Senate. He traced the pattern with his finger, feeling the slightly raised ridges where the wax had cooled unevenly. A strange unease settled over him. In his years of service, he had learned that unusual seals meant unusual dangers. Still, he carried the chest to the restricted vault, where only 3 people in the entire city were allowed entry: himself, his deputy, and the Praetorian prefect. The problem of the unwritten rule. The archives had rules, long lists of them, each written on heavy tablets, hung near the entrance. But alongside the written rules were the unwritten ones, understood by every experienced archivist. One of these was that an archivist had the right, even the duty, to examine and summarize any document placed in the vault. The reasoning was simple. If the emperor died suddenly, or if civil war broke out, someone had to know what lay hidden in the archives. Knowledge could be the difference between a smooth succession and chaos. Marcus had invoked this unwritten rule only twice in his career, and each time it had been to quietly inform a trusted senator that certain records existed, records that could prevent the spread of false histories. The chess now before him was testing that boundary in a way it never faced. The letter was explicit. The seal was not to be broken. Yet the archivist's oath to preserve the truth whispered another command: the quiet surveillance for the next several days. Marcus left the chest untouched in the vault, but he noticed small changes in his surroundings. The guard rotation at the archives entrance was altered. Men he had never seen before stood watch, their armor polished, but their eyes cold. The Praetorian prefect visited the archives twice in a single week, an almost unheard of occurrence. And then there was the second courier. He arrived at dusk, carrying nothing but a small strip of parchment. It bore no seal, only a single sentence. In a hand Marcus did not recognize. There are those who will come for what you hold. Decide now whether you serve the living emperor or the truth that outlives him. Marcus burned the parchment after reading it. Cass, with its words, followed him into his sleep. The night decision in the 4th week after the chest's arrival. Marcus made his choice. It was not made in a moment of passion, but in the slow accumulation of unease. He waited until the archives were empty, the guards drowsy at their posts, and carried the chest to his private office with the tools of his trade: a thin bronze pick, heated blade, and a cloth soaked in oil. He worked at the seal. He moved carefully, softening the wax without breaking it, teasing the bronze bands loose without leaving a mark. When at last the lid creaked open, a faint smell of smoke drifted out, as if the contents had been near fire. Inside were 3 scrolls, each wrapped in thin sheets of beaten gold. The gold was engraved with patterns, not words, but a lattice of symbols Marcus had never seen. He unwrapped the first scroll with trembling hands. The writing inside was in Latin, but the phrasing was strange, the sentences looping back on themselves. It read less like a formal report and more like a confession. He read only a single line before stopping. If you are reading this without my consent, know that you are holding the record of my last 7 nights, and with them, the reason the empire will fall. Shh. Marcus sat back, the words echoing in the dim room. The last 7 nights. The reason the empire will fall. He understood that opening the chest had not been the difficult part. The difficult part would be deciding what to do next. Marcus sat in his chair for what felt like hours, though the faint sputter of the oil lamp told him it had been only moments. The gold-wrapped scroll lay before him, half unfurled, its edges trembling as if it too felt the weight of what it carried. He stared at the opening line again. If you are reading this without my consent, know that you are holding the record of my last 7 nights. And with them, the reason the empire will fall. The words themselves were a trap. They offered no safe retreat. Not for Marcus, not for anyone who read further. He could roll the scroll back up, replace the seal, and pretend nothing had happened. He knew the thought would gnaw at him forever. And there was the other possibility that whatever was written inside would reveal a danger not just to the emperor but to Rome itself. He took a slow breath and kept reading. The emperor's first night. The writing was more personal than Marcus had expected. It was not the clipped, formal style of imperial decrees, but something raw, almost fevered. The Emperor Caracalla wrote in the first person, unflinching and without the softening of official scribes. On the first night, he described a dream. A vast plain under a black sky where the sun was a pale coin and the wind smelled of iron. From the horizon came a sound like marching feet, though he could see no one. In the dream, he dug into the ground with his bare hands and unearthed a gold mask. When he put it on, the footsteps stopped. But so did the beating of his own heart. Caracalla awoke, gasping, certain it was a message. He summoned the palace soothsayers, who whispered that the dream was a sign that an emperor would wear gold in his death, not as adornment, but as a seal to keep his spirit bound. The second night, the diary shifted tone. The emperor wrote of finding a set of old tablets hidden in a locked chamber of the imperial library. These, he claimed, had been written during the reign of Augustus, but suppressed by later rulers. They told of an unbroken chain of knowledge passed from emperor to emperor, a record of each one's greatest fear and most dangerous secret. The tablets, Caracalla wrote, spoke of a ritual in which the final writings of an emperor were not burned but sealed in gold, not as treasure but as a kind of prison. The gold, malleable and incorruptible, was thought to hold words in a suspended state, safe from decay, yet dangerous to release. The third night here, Marcus noticed a tremor in the handwriting, as if the emperor's hand had faltered. Caracalla described visiting a vault deep beneath the Palatine Hill. It's accessible only through a series of hidden staircases known to the imperial family. There, he found the gold-sealed diaries of past emperors, some no larger than a man's palm, others so heavy they required 2 men to carry. He confessed to opening one. Inside were not edicts or political plans, but confessions, the unvarnished thoughts of rulers at their weakest moments, betrayals of friends, quiet murders, spheres of divine punishment. But it was the last page of one diary belonging, according to the emperor, to Tiberius, that chilled him. It read, "If this gold is opened, Rome will never again belong to her people. She will belong to the keepers of memory." The fourth night, Caracalla began to write of voices. It's claimed that after reading the old diaries, he could not sleep without hearing whispers in languages both ancient and unknown. The voices, he said, were not random. They told him things, details of Senate conspiracies, troop movements in distant provinces. Even the private thoughts of his own mother. He began to suspect that the gold-sealed diaries were not merely records, but conduits, objects that somehow preserved more than words. Marcus's dilemma. By the time Marcus reached the fourth night, his hands were damp. The diary's contents were dangerous in two ways. Politically, because they hinted at secrets that could destabilize the empire. Metaphysically, because they suggested that the act of sealing words in gold might bind more than ink. His mind turned to the strange symbol on the chest sill, the flame encircled by rings. He remembered now where he had seen it before, on the inventory tag of a set of scrolls ordered destroyed during the reign of Domitian. Those scrolls had never been read aloud. The archivists who handled them swore they could feel a faint vibration through the parchment, as if it were alive. The visit from the prefect 2 days later. Before Marcus could decide whether to read the remaining 3 nights, the Praetorian prefect himself came to the archives. A tall, heavy man, with eyes like polished iron. He rarely spoke more than necessary. "I trust the chest remains untouched?" the prefect asked. His voice carried the weight of a man who did not ask twice. Marcus felt the lie in his mouth before it left his lips. "Yes, the seal is unbroken." The prefect nodded slowly. "There are those who might wish to interpret its contents in ways not intended by His Majesty. Best that it remains in darkness until the Emperor himself decides otherwise." He left without another word, but the unspoken threat hung in the air long after he was gone. The final 3 nights that evening, Marcus returned to the diary. If he was already guilty, he reasoned, he might as well be guilty of knowing the whole truth. On the 5th night, Caracalla claimed to have melted a small amount of gold from a ceremonial coin and poured it over his own hand, letting it cool into a thin shell around his skin. He described feeling an immediate stillness, as if all the noise of Rome had faded. When he broke the shell off, he swore he could still hear voices, but now they were asking him questions. On the 6th night, he performed the same act over the cover of the diary itself, sealing it in gold between entries. He wrote that the voices grew sharper, more insistent, and that one of them, deep, patient, and cold, had told him that the gold was not a prison, but a door. The 7th night's entry was the shortest. "Tomorrow will seal this diary completely. No one must read it, not even me." Beneath those words was a smear of gold leaf, pressed into the parchment as if to hide something underneath. The archivist's choice Marcus leaned back, his eyes aching from the lamplight. The diary was unlike anything he had encountered. It was both confession and warning, history and prophecy. If he followed the emperor's command, he would reseal the chest and lock it away, perhaps for centuries. The truth would die with him, preserved but unseen. If he defied the command, he could copy the diary, share it with others, but that would mean his own death. And perhaps worse, if the talk of doors was more than superstition. He closed his eyes and thought of the message from the anonymous courier. "Decide now whether you serve the living emperor or the truth that outlives him." The oil lamp sputtered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. When Marcus relit it, the gold-wrapped scrolls seemed to gleam more brightly than before, as if daring him to act. The archives were never truly silent. Even in the dead of night, the stone walls seemed to breathe. The ancient wooden shelves creaked softly, and from somewhere in the maze of papyrus and parchment came the faint scurrying of mice that had long since learned to avoid the archivist's traps. Marcus stood at his table with the emperor's diary laid open before him. He had read every word, felt the weight of its warnings, and still had no decision. His lamp cast a trembling light across the gold foil that lined the edges of the scroll. Each flicker made it look like the gold was moving, as though there were something alive beneath the surface. The rule of the silent archivist there had always been rules in the archives. The first and most sacred was that a record, once stored, was never destroyed. alterations were forbidden. Even emperors had to work through the senior archivists if they wanted a document removed. But there was another, less formal rule, one spoken of only in whispers among the elder keepers. It said that some records were not to be read, not because they were forbidden, but because to read them was to risk becoming part of them. Marcus thought of that now. The gold-sealed diaries he had read about in Caracalla's own words. How many archivists over the centuries had ignored this rule and been lost to it? But decisioned by morning, Marcus knew there was no safe path. The prefect would return soon to take the chest back to the palace. He could reseal it, return it, and leave, knowing he had hidden something that could change the way Rome understood its emperors. Or he could defy the emperor, copy the contents, and trust that time would eventually bring the truth to light. He chose a third option. Marcus fetched a thin sheet of vellum Kai used for the most delicate transcripts. With a reed pen, he began copying the diary, not word for word, but enough to preserve the essence of each night. He omitted certain details, the exact location of the vault beneath the Palatine, the ritual with the gold shell, and the final smear of leaf over the last sentence. Instead, he wrote the diary as a series of questions, preserving its meaning but making it useless to anyone seeking to reenact the rituals. The disguise when he was done. Marcus rolled the copy into a tight scroll and slid it into a hollow section of one of the archive's index rods, the long, wooden batons that held the catalog of stored works. It was an old trick known only to a few. The rod would be returned to the shelf with hundreds of others, indistinguishable to the untrained eye. The original diary he carefully rolled back into, its gold wrapping pressing the softened edges to mimic the seal's original contours, using powdered resin and a heated bronze stamp. He imprinted the flame-ending symbol once again. It was not perfect, but it would pass under casual inspection, especially if the prefect trusted him enough not to look too closely. The prefect returns 2 days later. The prefect returned. His men carried the chest away with the casual precision of soldiers who knew better than to ask questions. The prefect lingered a moment, looking at Marcus with an unreadable expression. "You have served the Empire well," said. Marcus bowed his head, not trusting himself to speak. The prefect's gaze held him for a moment longer before he turned and left. The emperor's death within a year. Caracalla was dead, assassinated on the road to Carhae by one of his own guards. His death was quick, but his burial was anything but ordinary. Rumor spread that when his body was brought to Rome, the gold-sealed diary had been placed in his tomb. Some said it was to honor his wishes. Others claimed it was to keep his spirit from wandering. Marcus knew the truth. The diary had not gone to the tomb. It had been taken to the vault beneath the Palatine, sealed away with the others. The prefect had ensured it, but the copy remained in the archives, hidden in plain sight. The hidden years, decades passed. Marcus aged, his hair silvering, his hands growing slower with the pen. Emperors came and went, each leaving their own trail of records and secrets. The gold-sealed diaries remained in their vault, their existence known only to the highest ranks of the imperial household, and to one aging archivist who had buried a question inside the archives themselves. It was not until Marcus was near death that he passed the knowledge to another, a young scribe named Flavianus, chosen for his steady hand and quiet nature. Marcus did not tell him where the diary was, only that somewhere in the archives catalogs was a set of questions, and that someday, when the empire's walls began to crack, those questions should be read aloud. The fall and the fire centuries later. In the chaos that followed the sack of Rome, the archives were plundered. Scrolls were stolen, others burned in great piles. Many records vanished forever, but when the smoke cleared, few shelves remained untouched, spared not by chance, because they had been hidden behind a false wall built generations earlier. Among them was an index rod with a hollow center, and inside a scroll of questions written in the hand of Marcus Valerius, Quintallus. By then, no one alive knew what the questions referred to. They were copied into the new catalogs of Constantinople, where they became a curiosity, a fragment of unknown origin, too strange to discard, but too incomplete to understand. The last question and, yet, the final line of Marcus's hidden copy remained the same as the last line of the emperor's diary. Before the gold leaf smear, if these words are spoken aloud, the keepers of memory will return to claim what is theirs. What Caracalla had meant, Marcus could never know, but in preserving that final question, he ensured that the mystery of the gold-sealed diaries and the strange power they hinted at would never truly disappear. The archivist's legacy history would never name Marcus Valerius Quintallus. His work was uncredited, his decisions unrecorded. But somewhere, deep in the labyrinth of forgotten records, his hand had left a seed, one that might, in some distant future, bloom into truth. And perhaps that was enough. It was the winter of 1042 when the ship arrived from the west. The waters of the Golden Horn lay dull under a low sky, the clouds pressing close like a heavy curtain, muting the colors of the city's spires and domes. Traders from Venice, Amalfi, and even further ports in the crumbling Latin lands brought goods to Constantinople. But on that day, one crate stood apart. The manifest said nothing unusual. Scrolls, Latin origin, bound for the imperial scriptorium. No mention of the chest's age, or that its lid was bolted with iron hinges, green from centuries of salt air. The scribe, who noticed it, Andronicos of Trebizond, was no ordinary scribe. He was one of the few in the Byzantine court permitted to handle foreign manuscripts without a translator present, not because he spoke every tongue, but because he had an instinct for structure, a way of identifying where something didn't belong. He had cataloged hundreds of scrolls in his life, ecclesiastical decrees, cases, military records looted from fallen cities. But when the crate was pried open and the musty smell of old cedar and iron filled the air, his eyes went straight to a single bundle among the jumbled rolls. It was wrapped in a sheath of hammered gold leaf, dull with age, but still catching. The dim light and stubborn glimmers, no wax seal, no string, only the gold itself folded over the ends, as though it were a skin, a forgotten insignia pressed in two. The gold was a mark so faint it took him several minutes to make out. Two interlocking rings surrounding a stylized flame. Andronicos' pulse quickened. He had seen that mark once before, years earlier, in a crumbling copy of an imperial codex attributed to the Sambrian dynasty of Rome. The footnote had called it the sign of the night ledger. No one in the scriptorium knew what the night ledger was. The note had been copied faithfully for centuries, long after the original meaning had been lost. The problem of ownership, Andronic knew the rules. Every manuscript entering the scriptorium from abroad was technically the property of the emperor, in this case, Constantine the Ninth Monomachos. The proper procedure was to deliver it to the master of records, who would decide whether it belonged in a private imperial collection or the general archives. But this was different. The gold was thick enough to be valuable, even if the scroll inside was worthless. Gold had no place in ordinary binding. If it was sealed this way, it meant either someone wanted it to last forever, or someone wanted it to never be opened. The quiet theft that night, Andronicos lingered in the archive under the pretext of repairing a damaged Greek translation of Galen. When the last of the junior clerks left, he took the gold-sealed scroll and hid it in the lining of his writing desk, beneath the false bottom he had carved years ago for hiding coins from the tax collectors. He told himself it was only temporary, that he would examine it for damage, perhaps clean it, then quietly return it to the pile before anyone noticed. But in truth, the moment the scroll touched his hands, he knew he wouldn't let it go so easily. The attempt for 3 nights, he resisted. He ran his fingers over the folded gold, feeling the faint ridges where it had been pressed together. Centuries earlier, he studied the mark again and again, comparing it to the codex illustration, and each night he dreamed always the same dream. He would find himself walking down a long stone corridor, lit only by a single lamp. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding scrolls wrapped in gold. At the end of the corridor stood a figure in a heavy Roman cloak, its face hidden. When he tried to speak, the figure would raise a hand in warning, and the lamp would go out. On the 4th night, he decided to open it. The tools breaking gold without destroying what it wrapped required skill. Andronikos knew of a method used by the restorers of ancient icons. A thin ivory blade, smooth to a fine edge, could be slid under the fold and lifted without tearing the parchment beneath. He worked slowly, cuting the gold just enough with the breath of a candle flame to make it pliable. The metal softened, releasing a faint metallic tempest into the air. It gave way reluctantly, like something that had been holding its breath for hundreds of years. The first lines inside was a scroll of darkened parchment, its edges crisp and brittle. The ink, astonishingly, was still sharp, though faded too. A reddish brown, the script was Latin, neat and deliberate. In the hand of someone accustomed to recording matters of state, Andronikos began to read. Night after night, I walk among the chambers below, counting the years in gold. The words are not mine alone. They come from before, and before that, and before that. Still, I am only their keeper. The next passage mentioned the Palatine, and a vault of night accessible only by those who bore the mark of the rings in flame. Andronikos felt the hairs on his arms lift. This was no ordinary diary. The warning a dozen lines in the tone shifted, greater than to the reader who breaks this seal. Know that your eyes are no longer your own. They will see what mine have seen, whether you wish it or not. When the seal is gone, you have already begun. He set the scroll down, heart pounding. The words were almost theatrical, the kind of thing a dramatist might write. And yet, he could not shake the feeling that they were meant for him. That night, the dream returned. Only this time, the cloaked figure at the end of the corridor spoke. It said, now you walk among us. It's the pull of the words over. The next week, Andronikos read the scroll in fragments, always returning to certain passages, ones that described a ritual of sealing, where molten gold was poured over the edge of the parchment as the last words were read aloud. The text spoke of memory as a thing that could be anchored, not in the mind, but in the metal itself. The gold was not decoration. It was the vessel. Breaking it, the scroll implied, was like opening a tomb. Andronikos wondered how many others had read these words before him, and what had happened to them. The decision to hide by the second week, he had decided he could not keep it in his home. Too many things felt off. He began forgetting small tasks, whether he had copied a page, whether he had eaten that morning. Sometimes, in the middle of writing, his hand would produce letters in Latin without conscious thought, as though the scroll's voice had slipped into his own. So he took it to a small monastery library outside the city walls, a place so humble the imperial clerks rarely visited. There, in a storage chest beneath a pile of wormitones, he hid the gold wrapping separately from the scroll itself, so no one would know they belonged together. The unfinished reading, he'd never finished the diary. One morning, a messenger arrived from the palace, summoning him to assist in translating a set of Arabic astronomical texts. He left the monastery, intending to return in a few days, but he never did. Accounts differ. Some say he died in a sudden fever, others that he simply vanished one night. His room in the scriptorium left exactly as it was, still wet on the page. The gold wrapper and the scroll remained hidden for centuries. The monastery eventually abandoned, its library forgotten under layers of dust. By the time the gold wrapper and the brittle parchment saw daylight again, 3 centuries had passed. Constantinople had fallen, its name changed to Istanbul. A cave in the domes of the Hagia Sophia now shimmered under the crescent moon. The Byzantines were gone. Their archives were scattered, sold, burned, or quietly absorbed into the vast Ottoman record system. The monastery where Andronikos had hidden the scroll had long since been repurposed as a Sufi lodge. Most of its books, worm-bitten, mold-streaked, written in forgotten tongues, were carted away to the imperial treasury's manuscript vault, a subterranean complex beneath Topkapi Palace where rare and potentially dangerous texts were kept under lock and key. The keeper of unread things in 1574. The man responsible for that vault was Hafiz Ibrahim, scholar whose official title, Defter Esrar, keeper of secret ledgers, hardly described the true nature of Hassas. His work, his duty, was not to read what was stored in the vault. Quite the opposite. His job was to ensure that many of the books, scrolls, and codices there remained unopened. Some contained heterodox religious commentary, others technical knowledge on siege machines or poisons. But the most unsettling were the works whose origins were murky, texts no one could confidently place in any known tradition. These were locked in a smaller chamber within the vault, behind a copper-plated door whose key was worn around Ibrahim's neck. Asterisk, the box that didn't belong. Scroll came to his attention, not because of its gold. The Ottoman court was awash in gold, but because of the box. It was a plain chest of linden wood, badly warped, its hinges rusted to a powdery red. The wood bore faint traces of an inscription in Greek, half effaced by time and damp. Inside lay the gold sheet, folded flat like a shroud, and beside it, the rolled parchment. They were stored separately, but a thin film of corrosion clung to the gold in the same places where the parchment's edge had darkened, suggesting they had once been sealed together. Asterisk, the temptation of the Syllabrium was a man of procedure, but also a man of dangerous curiosity. Each week, he performed an inspection of the vault, checking for signs of decay. When he came to the scroll, he would linger, tracing the faint Flamendring's emblem pressed into the gold. The symbol meant nothing to him, at least not at first. But after some weeks, he began to dream of it. The dream always began the same way. He stood in a narrow stone hall, lit by a single oil lamp. On either side were shelves of golden-wrapped scrolls. At the end of the hall, a cloaked figure waited in silence. It was an echo of the dream Andronikos had described centuries earlier, though Ibrahim, of course, knew nothing of that. The court's distraction. The year was busy with palace intrigue. Murad III had just ascended to the throne, and the court was occupied with shifting allegiances, reassignment of posts, and the endless negotiations over stipends. This gave Ibrahim the privacy he needed to indulge his interest. Asterisk, he decided to study the scroll in secret, reasoning that as its custodian, he had the right to inspect it for archival integrity. He retrieved the gold sheet first, feeling its improbable weight, too heavy for mere decoration. Then he unrolled the parchment, noting the surprisingly sharp Latin script. Reading without understanding, Latin was not Ibrahim's strongest language. He could pick out fragments: noctis, aurum, custos, night, goldkeeper. The repetition of certain words drew his attention, a cadence to the writing, as though it had been meant to be recited aloud. But what unnerved him most were the occasional phrases that seemed to address the reader directly. Greater than, the one who breaks the circle becomes the circle. You are the last to read these words, though you will not be the last to carry them. Ibrahim had seen enough esoteric works to know that such phrasing could be anything from mystical allegory decoded political commentary. Still, something in the tone struck him as personal. Asterisk, the unintended opening. He had no intention of breaking the gold seal. It had already been broken long before. But in unrolling the parchment too far, a brittle section near the end tore slightly, releasing a faint metallic scent into the air. Gold dust, so fine it was almost invisible, drifted from the tear. The particles caught the lamplight and seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, like a haze. That night, the dream returned. This time, the cloaked figure spoke only one word. Continue. The descent over. The following month, Ibrahim became obsessed. He began sketching the Flamin' Drink's emblem in the margins of his inventory logs. He searched the vault for other works bearing similar marks, but found none. He wrote to a contact in Venice, asking discreetly whether the emblem appeared in any Latin codex. No reply ever came, and slowly his behavior began to change. Colleagues noted that he spent more time in the lower vault than in his official chambers. Some said they had seen a light burning there late into the night, long after the palace grounds had gone quiet. Asterisk, the final entry. One winter evening, he brought a fresh sheet of parchment and an inkwell into the vault. He sat before the scroll and began copying its words, not translating, just reproducing them in careful, deliberate strokes. He worked for hours, oblivious to the cold. At some point in the night, the candle burned low, guttered, and went out. When the morning inspection came, the guards found the vault door ajar. Ibrahim was gone. On the desk laid the half-finished copy, and beside it, the scroll, now rolled tightly. The gold sheet folded once more over its ends, as if resealed by invisible hands. Aftermath. The incident was quietly buried in the bureaucracy of Palace's life. The scroll and its gold covering were returned to their box, this time placed in the deepest corner of the vault. Officially, the keeper of secret ledgers had been reassigned to a provincial post in Anatolia, and officially, no one ever saw him again. For another 200 years, the scroll would remain untouched, waiting for yet another pair of hands and another mind to test the boundaries of its warning. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. The Crimean War was still a recent memory, and European powers were circling like patient vultures, carving out spheres of influence under the polite language of trade, agreements, and protection. In 1857, a quiet, unpublicized auction took place in Istanbul. The imperial treasury was raising funds by discreetly selling duplicate or unnecessary manuscripts to European collectors. This was not the official story. Of course, officially, these were gifts to foreign dignitaries in exchange for political goodwill. But, in truth, it was a calculated emptying of shelves. Somewhere in the middle of this transfer, amid Qurans copied in the finest Kufic script, maps of old Venetian trade routes, half-legible Persian love poems, the wooden chest with the gold-sealed scroll changed hands. The Belgian collector, the buyer, was not a diplomat, but a Belgian industrialist named Edmond de Vries, a man who had made his fortune in steel rails and ship propellers. His interest in manuscripts was more than a hobby. He had an almost predatory instinct for objects that should not be for sale. De Vries had a sprawling home in Ghent, and in one corner of its library was a locked glass cabinet. He called his cabinet de Murmurs, Cabinet of Whispers. It contained works so obscure that even his closest friends could not identify their origins. The gold-sealed scroll took pride of place in the center. The language problem. De Vries had studied Latin as a boy, but this was no schoolbook text. The diary sentences were long, winding, full of elliptical references to events, people, and concepts with no explanation. He recognized occasional phrases: dies obscurus, dark day, memoria, legata, bound memory, aurum, clausum, closed gold. The problem was not just the Latin, but the voice. This was not the dry tone of a bureaucrat or the moralizing style of a philosopher. It was confessional, yet without seeking forgiveness. Intimate, yet deliberately withholding details. The descent into reading, the first night, he read only a few pages before stopping. But something about the cadence of the words lingered in his mind, replaying in half-sleep. The second night, he read more, and on the third, he stayed up until dawn. By the end of the week, his notes, written in a small, leather-bound journal, began to change. The neat, precise handwriting gave way to hurried, looping scrawl. First, he was summarizing, okay? Then, he was quoting directly. And finally, he began answering the diary, as if in conversation. What the diary contained, the surviving pages from De Vries's journal, now in the hands of a Belgian historical society, give us glimpses of what the Emperor Andronikos might have written centuries earlier, a repeated assertion that the empire was not merely a realm but a shape, circle of names, descriptions of a ritual involving molten gold poured over wax seals to bind memories into the object, itself an almost obsessive concern with the idea that thoughts could outlive the thinker if written in the correct geometry. The diary spoke of storms at sea, of messengers who never returned, of a meeting in a marble hall when no one spoke aloud, yet the room was full of voices. The change in De Vries' friends began to notice changes in the collector's behavior. Once a man of brisk confidence, he now seemed distracted in company, pausing mid-conversation as if listening for something far away. He was often seen tracing invisible shapes on tabletops or in the air, in letters to a colleague in Antwerp. He mentioned an experiment he was conducting, though he never described it in detail. He only wrote, "Greater than I think the gold was, not for wealth, nor for beauty. It was a door handle, nothing more, hey, and I have begun to turn it." The ceiling of the cabinet in the winter of 1858, De Vries hosted what would be his last dinner party. Guests reported that he seemed agitated, almost feverish, but eager to talk about continuity of thought beyond the grave. At the end of the evening, he excused himself and did not return. 2 days later, his housekeeper found the library locked from the inside. When the door was forced open, De Vries was gone. The gold-sealed scroll lay on the table, rolled tight. The gold sheet had been pressed into place with fresh heat. The edges were still slightly warped from melting. His notes were scattered across the desk. But the last page ended abruptly. Greater than once you begin, you cannot stop. Once you finish, you are not yourself, okay? And if I finish tonight, the sentence trailed off into an ink blot. The disappearance of Vries was never found. His estate was eventually broken up, and most of his collections sold to private buyers. Scroll vanished from public record. Some say it was taken by a French antiquarian who died in Marseille. Others claim it went to a Russian collector, whose archives were destroyed in the revolution. A persistent rumor among manuscript dealers held that the gold sheet still exists, somewhere in Europe, folded around nothing, the parchment removed. If true, it would mean the diary itself is once again unsealed, waiting for someone to finish reading what Andronikos began nearly 1,000 years ago. The unresolved warning, the emblem, the flame within the rings, has been found in exactly 2 other places. A fragment of mosaic from the ruins of a Byzantine chapel near Thessaloniki, and a wax seal on a letter housed in the Vatican's Archivio Segreto. No one has proven a direct connection, but the shape is unmistakable. And in both cases, historians have noted an odd reluctance to discuss the symbol at length, as though even speculation carries weight. Perhaps it is coincidence. Perhaps it is merely the residue of superstition clinging to forgotten artifacts. Or perhaps the warning Andronikos intended, the one sealed in gold, the one that has drawn and erased its readers for centuries, was never meant to be understood by those of us who ask questions simply because we cannot bear silence. The gold seal melted by the Roman Emperor Andronikos was not merely a lump of precious metal. It carried an emblem, a flame, within 3 concentric rings, pressed so deeply into its surface that the grooves caught the light like a wound. That mark was burned into memory for anyone who saw it, though most never learned its meaning. But the diary was not the only place this emblem appeared. Even as the scroll itself vanished and reappeared across centuries, the symbol was quietly traveling on its own, carved into stone lintels, stamped into wax seals, drawn in margins of unrelated manuscripts. And always, those who found it treated it with an odd mixture of reverence and hesitation, as though unsure whether they should record its presence at all. The Cappadocian monks, the earliest sighting after the fall of Constantinople, comes from 1462 in a set of travel notes by an Armenian monk named Vardan. Small brotherhood kept a monastery carved into the cliffs of Cappadocia, a place so remote that even the Ottoman tax collectors visited only once a decade. In his journal, Vardan described a visit by two strangers, tall men with speech like wind over iron, who carried a small brass reliquary. They asked to place it in the monastery's side chapel for one night only. Vardan agreed, curious about the contents. When the strangers left the next morning, Vardan peeked inside. There was nothing, only a faint smell of charred resin, and a scrap of wax stamped with the same flame and rings emblem. He copied the design into the margin of his journal, noting that it gave him the strange sense that the wax itself was listening. His drawing is the earliest surviving reproduction of the symbol after Andronikos' time, the Georgian manuscript, a century later, in the mid-1500s. The emblem appeared again, this time in the hilltop monastery of Gelati in western Georgia. There, in the margins of a liturgical codex, a scribe had drawn the symbol alongside a line of Old Georgian that reads, "Seal what you must until the year without a dawn." Modern scholars cannot agree on the meaning of the phrase. Some think it is a metaphor for spiritual darkness. Others suspect it refers to an actual calendrical event, though no such year without a dawn exists in Georgian chronologies. What stands out is that the codex itself contains nothing heretical, political, or unusual, just standard church hymns. The symbol seems completely out of place, as if someone added it to mark the book rather than decorate it. The border fortress incident in 1623. Near the volatile Ottoman Habsburg frontier, an Austrian garrison occupied a small fortress abandoned by its previous owners. The garrison commander, Hans Keller, meticulous record keeper who logged every detail of daily life, the temperature at dawn, the number of cannonballs in storage, the illnesses of each soldier. On September 18th of that year, Keller recorded finding a stone plate of no obvious function embedded in the wall of the powder magazine. It was engraved with a symbol that none of his men recognized, a flame enclosed by rings. That night, a storm rolled in from the east, and lightning struck the magazine. Keller noted that the gunpowder inside did not ignite, despite the blast, destroying part of the roof. He described this as a mercy from heaven, but made no connection to the stone plate, except to write in the margin, "We moved it the next day and buried it outside the walls." The location of that burial is unknown. The coin that shouldn't exist by the 18th century. The emblem began appearing in an even stranger medium, coins, a handful of silver pieces minted in the Crimean Khanate bear, a faint version of the flame witherings motif in place of a mint mark. The coins are otherwise identical to normal issues of the period, K, but the symbol is so lightly stamped that it almost disappears unless the coin is tilted in strong light. Numismatists are baffled. No record in the Konex Mint archives mentions a special design. A handful of surviving coins are so geographically scattered, one in Warsaw, one in Istanbul, one in a private collection in Cairo, that they seem less like currency and more like markers. The Vatican letter, perhaps the most unsettling reappearance, came in 1814, in a letter housed in the Vatican's Archivio Segreto. The letter itself was mundane, a note from a minor bishop in Dalmatia to to a cardinal in Rome, discussing the transfer of church property after Napoleon's defeat. The seal on the letter, however, bore the emblem in perfect clarity. Archivists photographed it in the 20th century and confirmed that the wax composition contained trace amounts of gold, a highly unusual and expensive choice for an ordinary correspondence. The cardinal's reply to the bishop is missing from the archive, as is any follow-up correspondence. Patterns in disappearance looking across these appearances, from the Cappadocian reliquary to the Georgian codex, the fortress plate, the Crimean coin, and the Vatican seal. One detail stands out in every case. Object bearing the symbol vanished within a few years. The reliquary left Cappadocia without explanation. The Georgian codex was stolen during a raid and never recovered. The fortress plate was buried and forgotten. The marked coins were withdrawn from circulation for imperfections. The Vatican seal was broken when the letter was catalogued, and the wax scrap was discarded. It is as though the emblem resists permanence, or someone ensures that no single artifact bearing it survives long in public view. The silent archivist sin. The early 20th century, a few archivists and historians began to notice the pattern. Letters were exchanged quietly between Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, asking about the concentric flame. The correspondence is polite but evasive. No one ever admits to knowing the symbol's meaning, but they all acknowledge its recurrence. One German archivist, in a private notebook now held at the Staatsbibliothek, wrote, "Greater than the more I see it, the less I believe it is a sign in the ordinary sense. It is not a crest, not a monogram, not a code. It is the mark of an agreement, but one made with the page, not the person." By the time the Second World War erupted, the quiet investigation into the emblem ceased. Archives burned, collections were looted, and objects that might have been linked to the symbol disappeared into the chaos. Yet, every so often, a researcher in an unrelated field, medieval art, Ottoman epigraphy, European numismatics, encounters the flame and rings in an unexpected place. And the cycle begins again. The question is no longer whether the symbol traveled beyond the emperor's diary. Its question is how it traveled, and who or what keeps ensuring that it is seen just enough to be noticed, but never enough to be understood. By the mid-1800s, the emblem of the flame within concentric rings had passed far beyond manuscripts and seals. The industrial age provided new surfaces, new transmission methods, and new ways for it to appear, and, as before, just enough time for someone to record it before the artifact or image disappeared. What changed in this era was the medium. The symbol no longer required parchment or stone. It began to write on paper, treated with chemicals on metal plates, even in the sequence of electrical impulses carried along telegraph wires. The first photographed, earliest confirmed photographic appearance comes from 1844 in the work of a French daguerreotypist named Etienne Rochefort. His surviving portfolio, now scattered among museums and private collections, includes a single plate labeled Simply Vue de la Fenêtre Matin. The image shows an ordinary Parisian street at dawn, cobblestones, shutters half open, a boy carrying bread. But in the upper left corner of the frame, faintly visible on the side of a wall, is the flame and rings emblem. Rochefort left no written comment on it. Experts who have examined the plate under magnification note that the emblem is not a later scratch or chemical stain. It is part of the original exposure, as though it had been painted or marked on the wall before the photograph was taken. Curiously, no contemporary street sketches or later photographs of the same building show any such marking. The building itself was demolished in 1852, and no drawings of the demolition survive. The telegraph code in 1868, a telegraph operator in Odessa, Mikhail Levin, recorded a message that baffled him so completely he copied it by hand into his personal notebook. The transmission was addressed to no named recipient. sent from a small coastal station. K. And consisted entirely of repeated sequences. 11. Suspecting a faulty key, transcribed the message on paper and overlaid the sequences onto a circular grid. A hobby of his when trying to visualize patterns. What emerged was not a letter or number, but a diagram eerily close to the flame within ring's emblem. The original paper from his notebook still exists in the Odessa Regional Archive, though the official telegraph log for that day has been lost. No one has determined whether the message was a code, a mistake, or an intentional insertion. But what unsettles historians is Levin's note at the bottom. Greater than I believe the pattern was not made by the sender's hand. It was made by the line itself. The architect's ornament, 1891. The emblem appeared carved into the lintel of a new government building in Vienna, an administrative office for municipal archives. The architect, Gustav Meisel, was well known for his taste in neoclassical motifs and for his strict use of historical references. When questioned by a visiting journalist about the flamandring's carving above the central door, Meisel seemed genuinely confused. He claimed no such symbol was in his plans, nor had any of his stonemasons suggested it. He assumed it was a flourish added by a subcontractor and planned to remove it. Yet, before the carving could be altered, an unexplained fire broke out in the building's entry hall, damaging the lintel and rendering the emblem unrecognizable. The fire destroyed a large portion of the building's archival holdings, ironically, many of them concerning medieval seals and insignia. The Baltic shipwreck in 1907. A merchant steamer named Runa sank off the coast of Latvia after a collision in heavy fog. Among the items recovered from the wreck was a metal lockbox containing trade manifests and personal effects of the captain. On the inside of the lockbox lid, etched in fine lines almost invisible under corrosion, was the emblem. The salvage crew noted it briefly in their inventory, but made no further comment. As the lockbox was sold at auction to an unknown buyer, the oddest detail is that the manifests inside lists of cargo, debts owed, and ports visited were water-damaged but legible, and several pages bore the same emblem faintly stamped in blue ink. Always in the margin and never touching the main text. The silent film, reeling, 1923. The symbol made what may be its most peculiar appearance in a silent film produced in Berlin. The film, Der letzte Turm, was a minor art house piece about a lone watchman in a collapsing city. In one scene, the watchman climbs a stairwell and passes a wall bearing a painted emblem unmistakably, the flame and rings. Contemporary reviews never mention it, and the film was considered lost after World War II. But in 1978, a partial print resurfaced in a private estate sale, missing several minutes of footage. The scene with the emblem remains intact, and film historians who examined it concluded that the symbol was not part of the set's design, but had been painted directly onto the wall of the actual building used for filming. No record of that building exists today. It was destroyed in an air raid, the coded map in 1946. Just after the war, a young British cartographer named Eleanor Marsh was tasked with cataloging captured German military maps. Among them was a hand-drawn map of the Eastern Front, with supply lines marked in red pencil dot in the upper right corner. Drawn faintly in graphite and almost rubbed away was the emblem. Marsh recognized it from an art history lecture at university and made a private note to research it later. But before she could, the map was reclassified, sealed in a restricted archive, K, and vanished from her reach. Years later, she recalled in an interview, "It didn't feel like a mark of ownership. It felt like a mark of watching." Still, the map itself were part of something older, and the war was just another episode in its long memory. Patterns of persistence by this point. The emblem had crossed almost every kind of medium: parchment, stone, coin, photograph, telegraph, pulse, architectural ornament, ink stamp, film frame, and cartographic sketch. Each appearance followed the same pattern, It emerged unexpectedly, without explanation. It was noticed by someone curious enough to record it. The object or medium bearing it vanished, was destroyed, or became inaccessible within a few years. This persistence across centuries, borders, technologies is the one undeniable fact about the emblem. It refuses to remain only in the past, and it refuses to be held for long. The failed decoding attempts between 1950 and 1970. A few scholars attempted to catalog every known sighting. The largest effort came from a Hungarian historian, Lajos Varga, who compiled a dossier of 42 documented cases. Varga's notes suggest he believed the emblem was a kind of mnemonic, not a coat of arms, but a trigger for recalling or protecting certain knowledge. Yet, Varga's work was never published. His manuscript was stolen from his study in 1971, along with several photographs of the emblem from different contexts. Only a few photocopies survive, scattered among his former students, and even those are incomplete. Others attempted to overlay the emblem onto maps of historic trade routes, lunar cycles, even early telegraph networks, hoping for alignment. None produced a convincing match. The symbol remained stubbornly opaque, neither purely decorative nor obviously functional. The lingering question if the emblem began with Androniko's sealed diary, then its journey through time defies ordinary explanations. Did it leap from an imperial object to the wall of a Paris building, to a telegraph pattern, to the lintel of a Viennese archive, to the frame of a Berlin silent film? And if it did not begin with Andronikos, if the emperor was merely one in a line of custodians, then what purpose could it serve? Surfacing only in fragments, refusing to be fixed in one age or one form. Perhaps the better question is not what the emblem means, but who ensures that it never quite disappears. By the mid-1970s, the emblem's history was already uncomfortably long. It had endured for centuries, flaring up in one medium after another, each time noticed just long enough to be recorded before vanishing again. But in the electronic age, something changed. Instead of existing in solid form, carved, painted, printed, the emblem began to appear as patterns, not just shapes that looked like it, but configurations of data that, when arranged or visualized, formed it exactly. It was as if the mark had learned to adapt to a world of ones and zeros. The first computer sighting, the earliest confirmed digital appearance, happened in 1977. Inside a batch of weather simulation data at the University of Illinois, a programmer named Dennis Walcott was testing a new way of rendering isobar maps. When one processed output, the pressure lines curved into the flame and rings pattern. Walcott assumed it was a glitch, but after running the same simulation multiple times with varied inputs, the emblem appeared only once, and only in a dataset that had been transferred from an older tape reel. When Walcott printed the image and showed it to a colleague in the history department, the man, reportedly, went pale and muttered, "That's not the first time I've seen this." He refused to elaborate, and the printout has since been lost. The disconnected terminal in 1982. Systems analyst at a New York investment bank, Janet Wu, stayed late one night to troubleshoot a terminal that kept locking up. On reboot, the terminal screen flashed a symbol before loading the usual command prompt. Wu described it as a flame inside a circle, inside another, like a target, but burning. She called in a technician, but by the time he arrived, the symbol was gone, and the terminal functioned normally. Log files showed no record of unusual activity. Out of curiosity, Wu searched the bank's internal documentation archives for the symbol and found a single, scanned page from a 19th century bond ledger. In the margin, faintly stamped, was the same emblem. The scan had been uploaded by an intern 3 months earlier, and the paper original could no longer be found in the physical archive. The shortwave broadcast, 1991. Amateur radio operators in Europe began reporting a strange burst of static. that occurred at exactly 1:17 UTC every Tuesday. Embedded in the static was a tone pattern that, when fed through a spectrogram, produced an image. That image, in its jagged, pixelated form, was the emblem. Attempts to triangulate the broadcast source pointed to a region of the North Atlantic with no transmitters. By 1993, the pattern stopped appearing entirely. The early internet anomaly by 1996. The emblem had crept into the growing space of the World Wide Web. A graduate student at the University of Helsinki, compiling an archive of Byzantine manuscripts, uploaded a scanned page from a codex dated to the 12th century within hours of going online. The image file's metadata changed without the student's input. The file size increased slightly, and when opened, the manuscript page had a faint overlay of the emblem in the background, visible only if the image was darkened significantly. Server logs showed no sign of intrusion, yet the altered image propagated to every mirror site that hosted it. Today, only a handful of archivists have offline backups of the original scan. Satellite glimpses in 2004. A hobbyist reviewing freely available satellite imagery noticed a peculiar shape in the Gobi Desert. The image, taken by a commercial satellite, showed a set of concentric rings nearly 40 meters across, with a central depression shaped like a flame. 2 weeks later, when the hobbyists returned to the mapping service, the imagery for that coordinate had been replaced with a lower resolution, cloud-obscured version. No high-resolution archive of the original image is known to exist outside of the hobbyist's personal hard drive, which, in a now familiar pattern, was reported stolen in a break-in months later. The digital appearances matter until the late 20th century. The emblem's sightings could be dismissed as coincidence, a recurring artistic motif, a flourish borrowed and adapted by different cultures. But once it began surfacing in data and simulation outputs, terminal boot screens, radio spectrograms, and image metadata, the explanation became harder to contain. Patterns in data don't just happen without cause. If they repeat exactly, they are either the product of deliberate design or some deeply embedded, self-replicating process, which raises the question, is the emblem an idea carried by people over centuries, or something that exists independently, a kind of cultural parasite that finds ways to reproduce in whatever medium dominates in age? The loop back to Roman 2011. An interdisciplinary team studying Byzantine intrigue, in collaboration with cryptographers from Milan University, stumbled upon an overlooked note in a 19th century catalog of antiquities. The note described seal in molten gold, marked with the imperial cipher and the unknown device of 3 rings and a flame, used to bind the personal writings of Andronicus, late emperor of the Romans. No image of the diary survives, and no contemporary Byzantine source mentions its fate. But this catalog entry linked the molten gold seal directly to the earliest known version of the emblem, confirming that the diary was not simply bound or locked, but sealed in a way meant to destroy it if tampered with. Gold was a curious choice. It is soft, malleable, and easy to melt, not ideal for security. Unless, of course, the goal was not to secure the diary physically, but to mark it with something permanent, to burn an emblem into memory, and perhaps to ensure that whatever was inside could only be opened once by a single intended reader. The missing pages, one fragmentary 15th century account, claims the diary seal was broken during the sack of Constantinople in 1453, but that the pages inside were blank. Another suggests the ink was of a kind that faded after reading, leaving only an impression in the parchment fibers. In either case, there is no surviving content. We do not know what Andronicus recorded, why he chose molten gold, or why he marked the seal with the emblem. Yet, every reappearance of the emblem since in stone, in ink, in light, in electrical pulses, in pixels, feels like a shadow of that lost act, as if whatever was written down did not survive on parchment, but was somehow released into the world, printing itself on mediums not yet invented. What we're left with today, the emblem, is still reported sporadically in corrupted image files, in test patterns from malfunctioning cameras, in GPS maps where no structure should exist. The most recent credible case comes from 2022, when a network security firm in Singapore detected an unauthorized packet of data pinging several unrelated servers worldwide. The data, when decoded as an image, formed the emblem exactly. The packet's origin could not be traced. The team's final report concluded with a sentence that could have been written in any century. Greater than we do not know if this is the work of a person, a group, or something older than both. We only know that it has not stopped. And so we return to the Roman emperor and his diary, sealed in molten gold. Whether he created the emblem or merely inherited it, Andronikos may have been one of the few to know what it meant. Perhaps he tried to trap it. Perhaps he tried to hide it. Perhaps, knowingly or not, he let it loose. If the emblem is a message, no one alive today can read it. If it is a warning, we have ignored it for centuries. And if it is something else entirely, we may already be carrying it in every device we own, waiting for the moment it decides to appear again. It begins not in the ruins of a palace or on the floor of a sunken ship, but in the stone chill of a monastery vault high in the Carpathian Mountains. The year was 1898, and a visiting historian named Dr. Emil Farkas had come to examine what the monks described with almost visible discomfort as the sealed relic. The vault smelled of centuries-old dust, of candle wax, and of wood that had been carved long before any of the current monks were born. At the center stood a narrow table, its surface protected by thick, untreated linen. Upon it lay a small, lead-lined box, no larger than a loaf of bread. The box was plain, save for the seal that had been pressed across its join, a disc of what looked like tarnished bronze, but gleamed in odd ways when touched by light. Farkas leaned in, squinting, and realized it was not bronze at all. It was gold, a seal that should not exist. What made this seal unusual was not just its precious metal, but its structure. The gold was not stamped or engraved. Instead, it was poured directly across the seam. Its edges fused to the box in a way that suggested it had been melted in place. Most seals, whether of wax, lead, or even softer metals, were meant to be broken, a deliberate action that left clear evidence of tampering. But this seal was different. The gold flowed over the box's edge, then hardened into shallow channels that appeared to have been carved into the wood beneath. It was a method that ensured opening the box without destroying the seal would be nearly impossible. But what unsettled Farkas most was the mark impressed into the gold. While it was still molten, 3 concentric circles, the innermost containing the stylized flame, the emblem, the monk's version of the story according to the monastery's records, sparse, handwritten, penned, often rewritten over the years. The box had been delivered in the early 17th century by a group of merchants traveling from the eastern Mediterranean. They claimed it was entrusted to them by a dying man in a coastal city they did not name, with instructions to bring it to a place of quiet prayer where it could be hidden indefinitely. The merchants were paid in coin, but they also demanded something unusual, a written oath from the monastery that the box would never be opened unless ordered by a living voice speaking the name in the seal. No one knew what that meant. For nearly 3 centuries, the monks had done as they were told. The box sat in the vault, moved only during times of war, when treasures were hidden deeper underground. Over the years, a few curious novices tried to research the symbol on the seal, but the effort yielded nothing more than scattered sightings of similar marks in old manuscripts. Farkas's examination, Dr. Farkas was not a man inclined toward superstition. He had made his name cataloging medieval manuscripts, many of them smudged with symbols whose meanings were long forgotten. Still, the sight of the seal stirred something unusual in him, not fear, exactly, but the prickling awareness of standing in the presence of an object that had passed through more hands and more centuries than any one life could comprehend. With the abbot's reluctant permission, Farkas examined the box under lamplight. He noted that the gold was not pure, but alloyed, yet in a composition unusual for European goldsmithing of the 16th or 17th century. It matched more closely the metallurgy of late Byzantine ceremonial objects. The gold's surface bore minute ripples, frozen waves where the molten metal had cooled too quickly. These suggested the pouring was done in haste, not the careful, ornate process of sealing for show, but a rushed act meant to immobilize something before it could be touched again. The decision to move it in his notes. Farkas speculated that the box should be taken to Budapest for proper study or X-ray photography. Then a cutting-edge technology might reveal its contents without breaking the seal. The abbot refused outright, insisting that removing it from the monastery would invite pursuit. He would not clarify what he meant, except to say that in the 1780s, after an occupying army briefly seized the monastery, 2 of the soldiers who had handled the box died within a month, both from sudden fevers that left no visible wounds. Whether this was coincidence or monastic folklore, Farkas could not say, but he left the monastery with only sketches and a detailed description, vowing to return. The theft of 1913. The next record of the box comes 15 years later, not in a monastery ledger, but in a police report from Vienna. In 1913, the monastery was broken into during a snowstorm, its vault ransacked. Several gold and silver religious items were stolen, but the most important loss, according to the monks, was the sealed box. The police treated it as an ordinary theft, but in their files, buried in the testimony of a local pawnbroker, was an odd statement. A man had tried to sell him a small gold object shaped like a curved strip. The man claimed it had been peeled from a larger piece. When the pawnbroker refused, the man left and was later found dead on a railway line. The fragment of gold was never recovered, resurfacing in 1939, in the spring of 1939. As Europe slid toward war, a small crate arrived in Trieste from Alexandria, addressed to an art dealer known for handling antiquities of dubious provenance. Inside was the box. The seal was still intact. The dealer, perhaps sensing that selling such an object could bring trouble, contacted a private collector in Paris, one with a documented interest in Byzantine artifacts. The collector purchased the box, but died suddenly in September of that year. His estate was seized by occupying forces, and the box disappeared again. The post-war accountant, unverified story, claims that in 1952, the box was seen in the private vault of a wealthy shipping magnate in Genoa. This man, obsessed with collecting relics tied to the fall of Constantinople, allegedly told guests at a dinner party that his golden flame was the only thing in his vault he would never open. By the time journalists attempted to verify the claim in the late 1960s, the magnate had died, and his heirs sold most of his collection anonymously through Swiss intermediaries. The box was not among the listed items. A modern glimpse, the most recent credible mention, came in 2007, when a conservator at a museum in Thessaloniki, who wished to remain anonymous, reported seeing a small, lead-lined box with a fused gold seal while inspecting artifacts on loan from a private collection. The item was not on the official manifest. The conservator said the seal's mark was worn but unmistakable, the 3 rings and central flame. The box was packed away again before she could examine it further, and when the loaned collection was returned, the box was gone. The unanswered questions: why go to such lengths to seal an object in gold? Gold melts at a relatively low temperature, but it is also inert, resisting corrosion. A gold seal could survive centuries without tarnish, making it as much a visual warning as a physical barrier. And what of the emblem? Was it the personal mark of the Roman Emperor Andronicus, or did he borrow it from an even older tradition? Could the box's contents, whatever they are, explain the emblem's persistence across history in forms both tangible and digital? No one has ever opened the box in documented history. No one has confirmed what lies within. It is possible that the gold seal hides nothing at all, that the contents are long since decayed, and only the story remains. But if that is the case, why has the object been pursued, hidden, and stolen for over 4 centuries? And why does every record of it seem to vanish just when someone gets close to studying it? The box had been missing for centuries, its journey marked only by scattered whispers, anonymous ownership, and sudden, unexplained deaths. By the time the 21st century rolled in, it was more rumor than reality, a footnote in obscure auction catalogs and in the fading memories of monastery archives. But for those who truly hunted such objects, the gold sealed box was an open challenge. In circles were antique maps and stolen manuscripts, traded hands under candlelight in back rooms. The box was known simply as the Flame, the first modern attempt, the earliest documented effort to open the box in modern times comes from a journal recovered in 2011 from the estate of one Henry Vallon, a French metallurgist and hobbyist treasure hunter. His notes detail a meeting in Geneva in late 1984 with a man identified only as M. The man produced the box, wrapped in rough linen and bound in leather straps, claiming it had been smuggled out of Athens. 2 years prior, Vallon was hired to assess whether the gold could be cut without disturbing the emblem's mark. Essentially, whether the box could be opened while keeping the seal intact for display purposes. Vallon's journal entries describe hours spent under a magnifying lens, tracing the flow lines of the gold. He concluded it had been poured in a single, continuous motion, with the molten stream running into carved grooves in the box's wooden body before cooling. Any attempt to lift it would shatter the gold into several pieces, each of which would show obvious breaks. In one particularly unsettling entry, Vallon writes, "When I tapped the gold lightly with a fine tool, the sound was wrong. A tay should give a dull note, but this rang faintly, like striking glass. I put the tool away and did not strike it again." No record exists of Vallon opening the box. His journal ends abruptly in December 1984. He was found dead in his workshop the following spring. An accident, they said, involving a fall from a ladder. The box was not found among his possessions. The auction that never happened fast. Forward to 1996. A London-based auction house specializing in lost imperial artifacts announced it had secured a mysterious gold-sealed chest for its winter catalog. The description matched the box precisely: light-lined wooden core, molten gold seal bearing 3 rings and a flame. The preview list drew enormous interest from collectors. But a week before the scheduled auction, the lot was withdrawn without explanation. When pressed by journalists, the auction house's director insisted that the item's provenance could not be sufficiently verified. Yet insiders claimed something stranger happened. On the night before the lot was pulled, the storage vault's climate control system malfunctioned, flooding the room with humid air. Several staff reported a burnt metal smell near the box's storage case, though no fire had occurred. Within 3 days, the box was gone, retrieved, they were told, by its original owner. No paperwork confirmed this transfer. The academic connection. In 2003, Dr. Sophia Karam, a historian at the University of Athens, began quietly researching imperial seals from the late Byzantine period. Her work focused on unusual metallurgical practices, and one footnote in her dissertation draft mentioned a privately held object that matched the gold-sealed box. In an interview with a colleague, never meant for public release, she claimed the seal's emblem bore striking resemblance to to a design used by Emperor Heraclius in the 7th century, later revived by Emperor Andronicus II. In the late 13th, both emperors had been associated with flame iconography and imperial propaganda. Though for different reasons, Dr. Karam's interest deepened when she realized the molten gold sealing method mirrored descriptions in a single surviving account of a lost diary kept by an unnamed Roman emperor. The diary, according to the source, had been sealed by his own hand with the fire of the alchemists, that no unworthy eyes should ever drink its words. This connected two strands of rumor, the sealed diary and the sealed box, into one potentially continuous object. The link to the emperor's diary, the melted gold diary legend, while dismissed by many historians, lingered in fragments of Byzantine Euro correspondence. A letter from a Venetian trader in 1324 claimed to have seen a book in a small chest, clasped, drowned in gold, stored in the treasury of a noble house in Trebizond. Centuries later, Jesuit inventory from 1652 described a confiscated relic, a box with gold sealing like water turned to stone. Among items taken from a wealthy Greek merchant suspected of heresy, this box was later transferred to an unnamed monastery. Dr. Karam suspected that the box in the Carpathian monastery vault, examined by Dr. Emil Farkas in 1898, is the very same object, and that it might still contain pages of the emperor's diary preserved under the gold. But when she attempted to track the box's modern whereabouts, she received a series of anonymous warnings to abandon her research. Within a year, her funding was abruptly cut, and she accepted a position abroad. She has never spoken publicly about the box since. Theories about the content scholars and collectors have long speculated about what could be inside. The theories fall into several categories. 1. The emperor's diary, possibly chronicling political secrets, military betrayals, or even forbidden philosophical reflections that could have been deemed dangerous to preserve. 2. Relic of the fire alchemists, a small device, vial, or substance linked to experimental metallurgy or early chemistry, sealed away to prevent misuse. 3. Religious artifact, an object tied to imperial propaganda, perhaps a relic claimed to confer divine legitimacy, is hidden to prevent rivals from using it. 4. Empty symbol, the box as a performative object, meant to signal power, wealth, and secrecy, regardless of whether it held anything at all. Yet, no matter the theory, the same question emerges. Why has no one simply melted or cut away the gold to look inside? Patterns of avoidance. Strangely, every recorded possessor of the box appears to have kept it intact. Even those who handled stolen goods or trafficked, looted antiquities without hesitation, seemed unwilling to destroy the seal. One explanation is economic. A box with a mysterious, intact gold seal commands higher value as an enigma than as an opened, possibly disappointing container. Another explanation is psychological. The seal has acquired a reputation as something not to be broken, a superstition reinforced by the scattered accounts of illness, sudden death, and disappearances linked to attempts to tamper with it in the monastery's telling. This avoidance was not merely superstition, but adherence to a condition placed by the original couriers. The box should never be opened unless by a living voice speaking the name in the seal. No one has ever identified what name that might be. The last known sightings in 2015. A grainy photograph appeared on an obscure internet forum frequented by relic hunters. It showed a lead-lined wooden box on a velvet cloth, its top half bathed in the light of a handheld lamp. The gold seal was visible, though worn, in a flame emblem unmistakable. The uploader, who claimed to have taken the photo in a private collection in Dubai, refused to answer questions. The post was deleted within hours, but not before several users downloaded and circulated the image. 2 years later, in 2017, shipment of antiquities seized by customs officials in Piraeus was rumored to include a gold-sealed box. Officials denied this, but two independent sources claimed the description matched perfectly. If true, the object vanished once again into the murky channels of private collecting. Unanswered threads. Could this box truly be the same object, sealed by a Roman emperor's own hand, containing pages of a lost diary? Was the molten gold poured by imperial order to safeguard the emperor's words from political enemies, or to hide them from posterity entirely? The seal is ever broken. The answer might finally emerge. But given its history, the question becomes just as intriguing. Has the seal survived this long because no one dared to break it, or because those who tried simply never lived to tell what they found? And if the gold itself carries a warning older than the box, a symbol repeated through centuries of imperial, religious, and alchemical history, then perhaps the real mystery is not what is inside the box, but why someone decided the seal must outlast the object itself.